Institute lecture series for this fall. The overall topic, Modern Societies in Crisis, Global Challenges and Solutions, is a topic that we could be discussing every day for the rest of our lives. And we will do it here we're doing it here in 13 lectures, just over 2 weeks. I'm very proud to have the support of so many of my colleagues here and elsewhere. And as a result, several of the presenters are UNM faculty, and some are scholars from New Mexico, and some are scholars in other states, and 2 are coming from abroad. And this would not have been made possible without the financial support also, but more importantly, the moral support and academic support of other constituencies within the university, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of the Provost, the University College, the Department of History, Feminist Research Institute, and what else? Peace Studies and we in International Studies brought our resources together. Equally important is the outside support we've received from the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence in the European Union. And I want to acknowledge Felicia Martinez, who is the executive director of that center. And within New Mexico, the New Mexico Humanities Council also helped make this possible. So I'm Eleni Pastea, and I am the director of the International Studies Institute, which has this outreach component, and it's also an academic program. We have over 200 students majoring in international studies, and Associate Director Christine Sauer, who has a class right now, actually couldn't be here, is very much the reason that this major grew so much in very few years, and also set the foundations for the lecture series that has been going on for about 10 years now. And we also passed around the audience survey forms. If you were here in the morning, you can put your comments about that also. And finally, we have a great crew videotaping this event, and we plan to make it available online. And that is no reservations with an assistant today. We will start with Dean Mark Bessany, Dean of Arts and Sciences, introducing this evening's program. And then Professor Angus Fletcher will introduce Tom Moritz, our speaker tonight, in a little more detail. And finally, Daniel Gordon, who gave the noon lecture, will be the respondent right after Tom's. And afterwards, there are a few things to have, treats, and more time for discussion. Thank you.
And I want to thank you so much, Eleni, for the tremendous energy you put into this, because it's one of those undercompensated tasks that someone takes on only because they're passionate about the work they're doing. So thank you for your passion, and my apologies for the undercompensation. It's a special pleasure and privilege for me to be able to introduce this series, because I've been a UNM lifer for at least 22 years, which is not a huge life, but I was a faculty member in political science and soon to be department chair when the International Studies Institute was created. And I was a member of the board of ISI for many years as what started as an effort to coordinate the area studies programs and to provide some opportunity for support for events like this. So the annual lecture series is something that has been a part of the ISI from the beginning, but then became one of the fastest growing majors at the university, probably in the history of the University of New Mexico, from 0 to 200 in a couple of years. It's just tremendous how fast this has grown. And Eleni and Christine have done an enormously, handled this enormous task with energy and passion and tremendous success. So I want to thank you, take this opportunity to thank you, because these sorts of events, these sorts of programs only happen because faculty invest their time and energy and passion into this. It's a structural problem with universities that departments are the center of academic life, and interdisciplinary programs and institutes, usually don't get the kind of support that they need. So now that I'm dean of the college, I get to institutionalize that lack of support, and it makes me feel somewhat awkward, but at least I understand the strangeness of the position. So welcome to this event, and I'm very excited to hear our speaker this evening, because this is someone who comes from a background of, I think it was an international studies major or some version of that 2 or 3 years ago. And then I got a master's in library science, and then since then has been trying to look at the interface between humanities and the real sciences, or the fake sciences, the social sciences that I represent. And someone who has really traveled this space in some interesting appointments at the American Museum of Natural History, California Academy of Sciences, the Getty Research Institute, where what does it mean to be part of the chief knowledge management?
Right.
This is such an
excellent question.
It's a strange position, but it sounds fascinating and wonderful. And so I know we'll have Dr. Fletcher, who will give some more detailed, hopefully some gossip about our speaker this evening. But to have someone who has traveled this space between the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, and can try to answer questions like, how do we nurture public reason in responding to climate change, is a really great thing for this speaker series and for this lecture series to be able to struggle with. And it sounds like in Tom Moritz, we have the perfect person to be able to lead us in this conversation.
Thank you.
And I'll turn it over to you. I'll eat my cookies.
Well, it's a pleasure, it's a privilege to be able to introduce Tom Moritz to you. And I was thinking about that. I shouldn't go on because we really have too much to hear from him about. There's an awful lot of knowledge to be organized, and so he's an expert in dealing with this vast excess of what knowledge constitutes. But I was just thinking, if you hang around in the world of academia long enough, what happens is you end up introducing each other to each other. And you have this strange experience of having known someone very well for a long time and then meeting him again, and as if new. There's a play by Ionesco about a man and a woman lying in bed, a bit uncertain at the beginning of the evening. They ask back and forth a set of questions, and it goes on in a surreal way, and then they finally find out that they've been married for 20 years. So, but this, seriously though, I met Tom in Los Angeles when I was professor at the Getty for a year of studies, and he was the associate director of the Getty Research Institute, which covers a wide field of research in all sorts of areas. But that was just one part of this growing acquaintance we've had. Since then, I've learned more and more in many conversations and back and forth by mail about the range of his concerns. They range from, if I remember correctly, meeting Nelson Mandela in South Africa, to traveling over the world, to speaking with groups concerned with the global environmental crisis in this country, in Washington, elsewhere in the West, also elsewhere in Europe, on a very high level of discussion. He's been doing this, and he's been probing the question as to how we think of what we think. how do we know what we believe we know? Now, this is a big philosophy question, and he's concerned with those issues and the meaning that they have for us as we look ahead in time. Scholars are inevitably, finally, get to be my age, to start looking back a little more. But it is also true that we are increasingly looking ahead. And this tests the question of what is known. After all, it was Albert Einstein who said, knowledge is less important than imagination, which is a way of him saying you have to look ahead as well as study what is known. So Tom's engaged in an enormous project of trying to determine the boundaries, the borders, the future, the constraints upon knowledge, for example, in the form of secrecy. It's a very clear issue with ambiguous boundaries throughout. All these things are part of his labors and his thinking. He is a person, however, in terms of the global environment, who's just fascinated by what's really all out there. I mean, he's the only person I know of who's ever really taken a good look at bristlecone pines, which are about the oldest trees in the universe. And at the same time, wandering around in Death Valley looking for desert fish that live in the desert. I mean, it's everywhere, it's a range. And this has been a thrill for me, because I also am a generalist, and I need to feel that there is work to be done which can clarify how we research and clarify unknown directions not yet taken. And that's what we're after. Listen to Tom, I think you'll see he's just a wonderful person to give me great, great hope about the difficult situations we're in. And that, among many reasons, is why it's a great pleasure and a privilege to introduce you, Tom, to this audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. Now we'll have to wait a few minutes for this Tom person to arrive. That's very humbling. Thank you for that, both of you, Mark, also for the introductions. I really appreciate it. Let's see. So we're going to do a slight turn here. Let my machine catch up with me. All right. So thank you both very much again. So I'm going to start out here, and I'm going to interject a few places. There are aspects of my experience that may help to explain why I'm addressing some of these issues that we're addressing. But this one is perhaps something that's familiar to a lot of you guys. Here we are down at Albuquerque. Is that pointer showing up down here? You can see that. So here's Albuquerque down here, and here's Folsom up here. Anybody been up there? Anyone been to Folsom? Really? Okay. It's probably one of the principal or one of the primary archaeological sites in North America for a number of reasons. These guys down here are Bison antiquus, which is the predecessor, the ancestor of our modern bison. Modern bison can be way up to a ton and run 35 miles per hour. These guys are bigger and stronger. And they existed here in North America up till about 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Up here in Folsom, back in about 1908, there was actually a black cowboy named McGunnity, who had been a former slave, and he was working as a cowboy, but he's also a very interesting guy. He was out riding in late August of 1908, just after a major flood had occurred. The town of Folsom, in fact, had been almost wiped out. And he was riding up a river valley just about 8 miles from Folsom. And he noticed that a whole lot of the stream bank had been washed out, and he looked down and there were a huge number of bones, just exposed bones in this stream bank. And he was a smart guy. He realized, first of all, that those bones were deeply buried. These were not superficial. They were not lying up there on the surface. And then he looked closer and he started to find spear points, like napped spear points, like that. In fact, that's the first one they found. That's called the Folsom Point. And so gradually putting things together, he himself realized the importance of this, but he wasn't able to get attention to this site until at least about 1918. He went to the Denver Museum of Science up in Denver, where I've done a little bit of work, and then eventually he got in touch with the American Museum of Natural History, where I was based for 7 or 8 years, and gradually was able to get scientists to come out and visit the site. And this is sort of what the site looks like today if you go up to Folsom. They won't tell you where it is, by the way. You have to kind of suss it out. And so it turns out what happened here about 10,000 years ago is there was a herd of these bison grazing down here at the lower end of this arroyo. And apparently there was a group of us, our ancestors, living in this area. And they managed to sort of move the bison back up this way toward this cul-de-sac, toward the dead end of this arroyo. And gradually this whole herd of bison moved up in there, and then the native peoples began to kill them with these spears that were pointed with this Folsom point. And they apparently killed between 20 and 30 of these bison. That's a lot of meat if the animals are more than around 2,000 pounds. They probably were. Well, what's interesting about this is, first of all, at this time, it was assumed that human beings hadn't even been on this continent for more than about 3,000 years. So immediately, everybody had to recalibrate and recalculate their understanding of when human beings arrived in North America. All right? And the other interesting thing, of course, is that this is one of the very early instances of human technology being used in a way that was very impactful on the environment. If you think that these big guys went away about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, there's a very good question out there, which is why. In fact, 80% of the large mammals that existed at about 14,000 years ago in North America disappeared. Camels, horses, dire wolves, short-faced bears, bison. There was an incredible large ground sloth, 8 feet tall. They disappeared. They went away. Saber-toothed cats, that's the state fossil of California. And so what was happening in this site was in some ways an early indicator of what has brought us to where we are today in our relationship to the global environment. Here's a much more recent picture. Anybody know what that is? Can you guess? That's the Colorado River. That's 1.5 miles south of the Mexican border. And basically what's happening there is the water stopped. There is no more water in the Colorado at that point. All right. Not too far from here, up near Santa Fe in 1921, Herbert Hoover was leading a commission. He was Secretary of Commerce at that time under the Harding administration, was leading what was called the Hoover Commission. 7 states represented, including New Mexico, and they were negotiating water allocations in the Colorado River. So the 7 states were negotiating this. You might notice someone was missing from the table. Mexico. Mexico was not at that table. And so a couple of things were wrong. So that's one thing wrong with that scenario to start with. But the second thing wrong with it was that they used water samples from the Colorado that were based on about an 8-year period, which they assumed to be typical or characteristic of the Colorado. In fact, the period that they used was a high water year, significantly higher, so that when they divvied up the water between the 7 states, the upper basin and the lower basin, which was more or less half and half, and then they allocated to states within each basin, they were using numbers that were far in excess of what the average flow of the Colorado River was. Now, of course, since then, in addition, my state, California, takes an additional 1 million acre-feet of water per year anyway. But even at that start, the data was not good. The data was not adequate to the task of allocating water. So not only was Mexico not represented, so that a major consumer, that delta of the Colorado River at the north end of the Gulf of California is one of the most fertile and had been one of the most productive deltas in Mexico. You can imagine all this wonderful water flowing all the way down from Wyoming and Colorado into that area. And essentially what you see here is what's happened. Okay. So what I'm talking about today is what I'm calling the burden of proof, nurturing public reason in response to climate change. And so what we're going to be talking about, I'm going to jump back now to my previous slide. Hopefully we'll be able to pop that right back up. I'm just going to walk you very quickly through this, and then we're going to jump into the full lecture. First of all, we live in a commons environment. It's a basic concept. One of the most obvious ones that we use is air. It's an atmosphere that envelops our planet, makes it possible for us all to even be here, for all living things to be here. And we share it spontaneously, obviously. There are a lot more to say about that, but essentially that's a good definition of a commons environment. There are other types of commons environments. I'll talk about that more. Right now, we're living under the forcing pressure of rapidly expanding human population. This morning, I was up at 5:45. I have a counter here on my little smartphone, and it told me that at 5:45 this morning, there were 7,229,321 human beings on the planet. And that's rapidly advancing. If I looked again now, it would be significantly more. All right? That's a huge number of human beings. There was a point at which there were even about 1.2 million years ago, when there were about 25,000 human beings on the planet. That was about equivalent to the population of gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, the other primates like ourselves. So human population has been expanding hugely. And by the way, just to be clear, it's not just human population. Our commensals are also expanding hugely. The FAO, recently I saw an estimate where they said they thought there were 37 billion chickens on the planet. This is actually the planet of the chickens, not the planet of human beings. 37 billion, that's with a B, chickens on this planet. And the same more or less applies to many of our commensal, that is plants and animals that we bring along with us in this ark that we're riding in. You know, dogs and cats, water buffalo, camels, take your pick, rice, wheat, you know, the major crops that we use. All of those things are hugely out of proportion to the rest of the world. I think I did a study about a few years ago, and they were estimating there might be about 9 million pelicans, just for an example, on the planet, as opposed to 37 billion chickens. So when we talk about biodiversity, it's always nice to sort of have that in scale to think about the implications of that. Okay, so we're talking about resources, the living and non-living elements of the world, of the world system that we use and are dependent on. They're at risk of depletion and exhaustion. For example, you think about fisheries, or of disequilibrium, and a good example is climate change. The system that was in balance for billions of years, literally, or millions, hundreds of millions of years, are now at risk of being either depleted and exhausted or in disequilibrium. And there are constant risks to human survival as a result of these previous problems. They're accelerating and intensifying. A great example is storms on this planet, which we know that both the intensity and the frequency of storms are accelerating and growing more powerful. We'll talk about that. Consequent risks to human survival are at global scale. People wouldn't believe this. I talked to an oceanographer in 1980s at the University of Washington where I was working, and he said he couldn't believe that human beings had an impact on the oceans. He said the oceans are just too vast. Well, we know for a fact that there has been an impact. So, and with respect to response, our responses to this set of circumstances basically involves either adapting, sort of like the Dutch, you put up a seawall and try and keep the ocean out, or you actually mitigate. You try and find ways to reduce the impact. And when we say mitigate, that's assuming that we all understand the changes that we're now experiencing are by and large anthropogenic. They're caused by human beings. There's still people who want to dispute that, but the science is basically in on that. The good news is that in the extensive history of human efforts to manage commons or common pool resources, there has been success in hundreds and hundreds of instances, contemporaneously and historically. We've been able to manage pasture lands, we've been able to manage forests, we've been able to manage water resources, irrigation systems, fisheries, like in the South Pacific. Human societies have found ways sustainably to organize and to manage resources like that. This has not happened at global scale yet. We have some indications that it can happen, that there may be some ground for optimism. And then finally, in arranging for these CPR agreements, human beings have created what are called deontic methods. That is, they simply work out systems where they either permit an action, an appropriation of a resource. They forbid it, forbid anybody to take it or some people to take it, or they have some set of requirements that govern how it can be appropriated. Okay, so the people that have focused on this problem, and what I'm going to talk about is basically our human capacity to respond wisely, which is dependent on our understanding through knowledge of the natural systems we're exploiting. Here's where the knowledge management part comes in. And it's also dependent on our understanding of how individual people make wise choices and of how human societies have organized and succeeded or failed in order to develop sustainable systems. So those are the two big pieces of what I'm going to be talking about. We're going to talk about the process by which we generate knowledge, and ultimately the critical problem with our current response is present by the latency period between when we gain knowledge and when we actually succeed in implementing wise policy. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. Okay, so relevant people will be Garrett Hardin, John Rawls, sorry there's Siri talking to me, Garrett Hardin, John Rawls, and Eleanor Ostrom, and I'll talk a little bit more about who those folks are too in a minute. All right, so that's just a little effort to get us warmed up. Sorry, here we go again through my all right. So Darwin, writing to Alfred Russel Wallace in 1857, noted, "It's lamentable how each man draws his own different conclusions from the very same fact." Of course, that's the dilemma that we face in the polity, in human organization, political organization. And how do we mediate that problem? And here's Immanuel Kant saying, and Kant wrote this back in the 1700s, "Nothing is required," he was writing about the Enlightenment, "except freedom, and the freedom in question is the least harmful of all, namely the freedom to use reason publicly in all matters." So this idea, of course, it goes back to the Greeks at least, if not other, and we could probably find instances of it in other cultures as well. But public reason is not exactly a fresh idea, but it's a very difficult one to implement. Here's John Rawls, the Harvard philosopher, writing about public reason. He's one of the major sources that I draw on here. Public reason specifies at the deepest level the basic moral and political values that are to determine a constitutional democratic government's relation to its citizens and their relations to one another. Pretty straightforward. Rawls is very careful to circumscribe his application of public reason. He doesn't, as we'll talk about soon, he doesn't assume that it can operate in all circumstances, in all groups of human beings. And he says it's public because it involves the free and equal citizens. It's the reason of the public. Its subject is the public good concerning questions of fundamental political justice. And whether or not the current climate change crisis constitutes such a question is an open question we can talk about. Its nature and content are public, being expressed in public reasoning by a family of reasonable conceptions of political justice. Notice he uses the word reason quite a bit. It almost seems wistful to me, like he's almost hoping that we can just, if he uses it enough, maybe he can convince us that it's really a possibility. But here he also talks about satisfying the criterion of reciprocity, which is fundamentally the sense of fairness that citizens in any polity, in any political or group want to feel, is that there's not going to be inequity or that anybody's going to be treated unfairly. Rawls has a whole book called Justice is Fairness. Okay. So he's concerned with an ideal normative conception of democratic government. He's not naive about what the history of this country or any polity has actually been. So here he talks about 5 different aspects of public reason, which he feels are all necessary for for public reason to obtain. One is, which political questions does it apply to? To whom does it apply? And he says that public reason actually operates only at the level at which our government officials and candidates for office are functioning. That's how he tries to constrain the problem. He says below that, there are 2 other levels. One is the level of media, and below that is what he calls the background culture, which is where all the fighting and scrapping takes place, the stuff that we're all so familiar with. And sometimes, if you think about the address that President Obama gave, what was a couple of years ago, when somebody yelled out, "You're a liar," or "You lie," that's an intrusion of that background culture into the higher level political culture, culture of public reason. And so I think I'll leave it at that. The reason that that background culture is not fully compatible with what he's defining as public reason is that there are many people in our culture and society who believe that they have comprehensive knowledge of the truth. You know, they believe that they comprehensively know what's true. And that's not a perspective, Rawls argues that that's not a perspective that can lead to comedy, to agreeable political action, and to deliberative reasoning, and to good policy. In fact, what he's calling for is enough of the public to recognize the need for public reason that they will actually evaluate candidates or judge their governmental officials on the basis of it. Okay, that's Rawls' model. So my own concept, my own observation about that is that a fundamental problem in building, sustaining any democratic polity is successful mediation between necessary adaptation for the common good and the centrifugal counter-social tendencies of individuals. I would argue that at a large scale, that's what we're facing right now in dealing with climate change. So to stipulate some models, the World Intellectual Property Organization uses this. It's commonly known as the knowledge pyramid. Down here at the bottom is digital data. Here is information which I take to be reasonable associations of data, often including hypotheses or theories. Knowledge which is generally consensual. It's an agreement that there is truth value to the observations that are being proposed, the theories that are being proposed. And then what this talk is really about is the link here between knowledge and wisdom. And what wisdom really means is, are we able to act on knowledge in a way that produces productive, creative consequences? That's the distinction between knowing something and seeing it implemented, acted on in a meaningful way in the public sphere. So there's some other, a student down in Peru, actually, this is at Turku University, did this one with respect to biodiversity. It's a little more detailed, and he included the real world down here. But here we have data. And by the way, I'm not laboring it in this talk, but I've done a lot of work on these concepts. Be happy to talk about it a little bit more if we choose to afterwards. And so here we have data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And what he's tried to do here is to hypothesize how specific types of data collection occur here, running between information and between data and information. Basic research, he runs it all the way up into the wisdom sphere. I wouldn't agree with that. I would say basic research generally doesn't involve implementation in a fundamental way. Maybe it involves education. Maybe it involves educating scientists, policymakers. Governmental research is number 3. It's here in this realm, running from data, information, and knowledge. So this is their model. You get the idea. Basically, they're trying to use this schema as a way of talking about how different activities that contribute to epistemology, to the development of knowledge, are actually operating. So technology, in my opinion, informs all of this, and fundamental to gaining, to our achieving wise action is insight, in my opinion. So the intersubjective, that is the relationships between people, domain of public reason is also the domain of what I call, John Searle at Berkeley has called third-person ontology. So third-person ontology is the realm of the sciences, generally speaking. And I've analyzed it in terms, this is from that talk I gave up at the Santa Fe Institute a while ago. I've analyzed it in terms of these major types of disciplines: engineering, physics, biology, cognitive studies, and social sciences. This is debatable, but what typifies third-person ontology, that is that it's objective and it's invariant. Objective in the sense that if any of us were to look at this from any perspective, we would still see it the same way. And invariant is that irrespective of circumstances, it would still hold true. Those are the two fundamental qualities of third-person ontology. So in building and sustaining a polity, we have to mediate between the necessary adaptation for the common good and centrifugal counter-social tendencies of individuals, I've said that already, And here's my approach to first-person ontology. So each of us carries this kind of a notion of the structure of the world around in us. And of course, this is obviously debatable or discussable. We can do that if you want to go in that direction. Elinor Ostrom, who's the Nobel Prize winner, we're going to be talking about a little bit more, actually talks about how individuals make choices. And she's an economist, so she tends to simplify it in terms of internal norms and what she calls a discount rate, which is really just the willingness of people to incorporate future concerns. Futurity, maybe in the sense that Daniel used it, in a different sense, I suppose, than he used it today. But, and the result is there are expected benefits and costs that are calculated. You choose strategies and then you get outcomes. So that's sort of her model for how individuals make choices and decisions into how to act in the world. Here's another, this is from the Harvard Business Review. This is another sort of an approach to the same question. Up here at the top, you notice purely philanthropic and purely commercial. And here we're talking about motives, methods, and goals. Appeal to goodwill in the purely philanthropic realm. Appeal to self-interest in the purely commercial realm. And of course, mixed motives, our favorites in the middle. Okay, this is from a colleague of mine down in Costa Rica, Andrea Ballestero, and I like this one because if you probably can make this out if you have some Spanish. Here it says responsibility and power on the vertical axis, and here it says knowledge in Western scientific terms on the horizontal axis. Here we have politicos, administrators, analistas and técnicos, and scientists. All right. So the scientists are obviously they're out here on the knowledge axis, but they're very low on the power axis. Similarly, the politicos are high on the power axis, but low on the knowledge axis. So the question is this a feasible strategy in moving toward public reason? That's essentially what Rawls is talking about, is that in a realm, in facing a global crisis like climate change, we need to move our political, our deliberative bodies, our deliberative individuals in government in this direction. Plausible? I don't know. Okay, so briefly talking about the progress of science, this is probably what Galileo saw when he first put his lenses together. This is probably a pretty good example of what he saw. And he was able to derive from this the fact that Saturn in fact looks like this. But it took a lot more science over many years, hundreds of years, for this to be firmly established. And it took 350 years for the Vatican to agree that Galileo was finally right, after putting him under house arrest. So here's the topic I really want to work through a little bit with you guys, because I think this is very relevant to what we're going to be working at here. Cholera was, it's been around for a long time, but it didn't hit England until 1831. That was the first cholera outbreak in England. And remember at that time, the knowledge of medicine and of the biological underpinnings, health science, was very weak still. It's a nasty disease, and it was carried around by sailors primarily, people moving from port to port. It was called the Asiatic cholera when it first broke out. And it was characterized by a high incidence of fatality in local areas. In one village of 550 inhabitants, 320 cases, 555 fatalities. And there were two different theories of the disease, but the prevalent theory at that time was that cholera was spread by air. It's called the miasma theory of cholera. In other words, London smelled so bad, it was a disaster. You know, that they would just put human excrement in the basement. They had cesspools, and it was much worse than that. The Thames was a disaster. This is a representative of what how cholera was envisioned at that time. But you see here dramatically that the idea is that it was involved with vapors, with bad air in London. This guy, Edwin Chadwick, was very helpful. He did a report in 1842 on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population in Great Britain, but he really didn't understand. He favored the miasma theory of cholera. And he was in a position to heavily influence public sanitation in London at that time. One of his great achievements was the introduction of the water closet, a flushing toilet. Unfortunately, he also decided it would be a good idea to have them all flush into the Thames at the same time. And in 1 year, they put, in 1 6-month period, they put 50,000 cubic feet of effluent into the Thames, which was a disaster. All right? But he was influential. He was raising issues of public health. Public health as a concept didn't exist. So at this point, they were really established, and the issues of sanitation, of hygiene, they didn't exist. All right? So science was advancing slowly. Another guy, William Farr, he was actually the registrar in the City of London. He was the first one to actually start recording births and deaths, just keeping public data on births and deaths in London. And it became very important. Those data became essential to solving this problem. But he was also in support of the miasma theory, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. He actually worked out a theory that if you looked at the altitude above ground and where cholera was occurring, those at lower altitudes were dying in greater numbers. And he felt that this was supportive of the idea that miasma really was the root problem of cholera. So this was Punch drawing a picture of Thames water in 1850. This was their idea of what might be going on in there. And actually in 1854, Filippo Pacini, an Italian who was experiencing a cholera epidemic in Florence, actually did microscopic studies and was the first one to identify the cholera bacteria. He was actually able to isolate it, and for many years they didn't even credit him with it. It was just recently renamed because they realized he had published on this 40 years before the credited identification of cholera existed. Very interesting guy. By the way, that's his microscopic slide up there with the cholera isolate there. All right, so here's sort of the story in my view gets really interesting. This is the Golden Triangle district of London. There was a cholera outbreak in this area in 1854. Fascinating story. And the index case turned out to have been a little 2-year-old baby girl who died of cholera. And her house was located right here in the center of this Golden Triangle area. They took her diapers, threw them in the cesspool. And then within a matter of days, a matter of weeks, this entire area was experiencing cholera contagion. In fact, these black bars, if you can make them out, are actually indexes. They're indexing the number of deaths at each of these addresses in this area. All right. So what I've just put in there, these blue stars are where pumps exist. These are water pumps. All right, water pumps. And there, that red one is what's called the Broad Street pump. So the index case occurred right here, immediately adjacent to the Broad Street pump. And there it is. These are the houses. These are all deaths that occurred in this house immediately adjacent to the pump. And then these are all deaths that occurred in these nearby residences. This was a very poor area. It had been a very wealthy area, which was settled. I heard one story of an apartment where a woman was asked if they were comfortable, and she said, "We were until this gentleman came." And they had a chalk circle in the middle of the apartment where that gentleman was living. They were sharing very, very densely populated residences, and with no hygiene, no personal hygiene, no public sanitation. All right. So this is the picture, and this is what John Snow, our hero, recognized. He was a doctor who had been an anesthesiologist. He'd given Queen Victoria anesthetic. He looked at this pattern and he thought, well, it's suspicious that there's so many deaths near this pump. But what he used that was so ingenious was he did what is called the Voronoi diagram. He actually drew a line around this area indicating where, if you walk by surface routes to this pump, this is the area that was closest to the Broad Street pump. And when he did that, the number of deaths that were within that area and immediately adjacent to it became really apparent. It was a brilliant piece of statistical analysis. And there was a couple of other factors. One is a woman who lived up in Hempstead Heath, who had lived in this neighborhood, loved the water, so she had the water imported to her in Hempstead Heath, and she died of cholera from the Broad Street pump. It was known for its quality of water. So this guy is given credit for being sort of the patriarch, the godfather of epidemiology. And he did even more. This is the Broad Street pump. What he did finally was just took the handle off the pump. And the epidemic pretty much stopped. It turned out that the index case, the little baby who died of cholera, they threw her diapers in a cesspit. The cesspit was immediately adjacent to the pump. And because of the poor plumbing, they communicated with each other, and the cholera bacteria went right into the Broad Street pump. And that was the result of the epidemic, in which hundreds and hundreds of people died at that time. So this is John Snow, who put this together. This is the Broad Street. There's a John Snow Tavern here if you ever go to London. If you'd like to celebrate epidemiology, you're welcome to go there. What else he did, though, is even more brilliant, was that he looked at the water supply of London in 1856, and what he realized was that this is a rough map of the supply. It's kind of a nice map. I like it. But these are the data that he used. He looked at two water supply companies, the Southwark and Vauxhall, and Lambeth. And Lambeth, in about 1854, decided to move their intake source for water upstream in the Thames, above the city. Southwark and Vauxhall used the same one, and here you see the result. 1/5 the number of deaths from cholera as a result of that change in the waterworks. So what this all tells us is that there was a gradual, there's more to say about this, but there was a way to solve this problem. The knowledge existed. The interesting problem is that London didn't actually act on this knowledge. Actually, London didn't act on this knowledge until 1866, when William Farr, the guy I showed you earlier, finally became convinced that cholera was waterborne. And in Germany, they didn't accept the Snow thesis until about 1900. There was a cholera epidemic. People continued to die of cholera despite the knowledge that was very conclusive. That gap between knowledge and wisdom in taking action, that latency period between having the scientific knowledge and actually acting on it, was not acceptable to the people that died of cholera, I would say. Not to be, employ gallows humor here, but it was not, that in a sense is the crux of the problem. Okay, so let's fast forward. I'm in Pakistan in 1994 doing some work on the National Conservation Strategy for Pakistan and for Nepal, okay? So I'm down in Karachi, traveling around Pakistan. I go up to Nepal, and I get really sick when I'm up there. I drank some water. I brushed my teeth without thinking of it, and I didn't use bottled or safe water, and I got very, very sick. I didn't die, but I got very sick. Let's just leave it that way. I know as a diplomat who once had to back out of a room because he got so sick from the water in Pakistan. Unsafe drinking water is a chronic global problem. Note this is from from our CDC, Center for Disease Control. An estimated 801,000 children younger than 5 years of age perish from diarrhea each year. That's not all cholera, but that is dysentery. It's the suite of diseases that result from unclean water, from the lack of sanitation. This amounts to 11% of the 7.6 million deaths of children under the age of 5. So unsafe drinking water is still a big, big problem. Okay, so I'm in Kathmandu in 1994, and I get sick. So I'm wondering about the water. I look up a World Health Organization report, and I find out that at that time, there were no no samples of water within the city of Kathmandu satisfied the minimum WHO requirements for water cleanliness. And the Nepali life expectancy rate was about 49 years. 49 years compared to what we have in the West. So babies were dying of cholera, and it was driving their life expectancy down more and more. What was happening in Kathmandu was that the British had put in plumbing systems and had put in sewer systems that ran parallel to each other. And just like at Broad Street, those systems were communicating with each other. You had flow back and forth between the water system and the sewer systems. And this is in 1994, okay? But it gets worse. So, all right, we have the Haitian earthquake, right? 2012. And here's the New York Times depiction of how it happened, of what happened, but guess what? A group of Nepali troops were sent to Haiti to help with the Haitian earthquake. One of those soldiers had cholera. Not only did he have cholera, but it was known that he had cholera. We know specifically because we know what kind of cholera spread out throughout the country of Haiti. And not only that, there had been no cholera in Haiti for 100 years. So these Nepali troops come, they build a camp up in the mountains, they use inadequate sanitary provisions, their latrines communicate with the river, And the first index case of a death by cholera is just downstream from them. Kind of crazy, eccentric guy who took his baths in the river every day, and he was the first Haitian to die of cholera. Okay. And because of our ability to type cholera, to look at specific strains of cholera genetically, we know it was Nepali, these Nepali soldiers. It wasn't the Nepali strain of cholera that got to Haiti somehow, right? So it's a done deal. The evidence is in. Here's another map. This is from Emerging Infectious Diseases of that same process. This is the progression of cholera. This was actually, let's see if I see it. This is July 2012. Yes, published in July 2012. At that time, there were over 7,000 deaths as a result of this process. Port-au-Prince has no sewers. No sewers. We're not talking about bad sewers or inadequate sewers. We're talking about sewers at all. And the Haitian government has filed suit against the UN because they have an agreement with the UN that said the UN was responsible for damages as a result of any interventions in Haiti. And so that suit, this was dated March of this year. So I don't know the progression of that lawsuit. Here's an exercise in public reason. So the point of all that, I think you get the point, is that there's very good science. The science was actually pretty much done by about 1860 or 1865. Done enough that London recognized it, and London never had another cholera epidemic after 1866. They solved the problem. But our global system, our problem did not solve the problem, despite the fact that we had thoroughgoing analytic, we had really good analysis of cholera, of the epidemiology of cholera. And even 2 years ago, we were losing 7,500 Haitians as a result. All right? So that's the crux of the problem. Okay, so what does that have to do with us? I'm not going to labor this too much, but this is the progression of Katrina coming up the Gulf toward New Orleans. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. Here's where it hit. This is on September 3rd. This is an aerial shot of the flooding in the city of New Orleans in this area. Bodies floating in the streets. We all remember that, I think. This is a report that was done by the Federal Transit Administration in 2012, and it's titled Flooded Bus Barns and Buckled Rails. A little bit prescient. Actually, in fact, in the 1960s, I think it was Roger Revelle, who was the head of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, actually mentioned the possibility of subways flooding in New York under the forcing pressure of climate change. So New York City, this is the path of Sandy, moving from down below. We couldn't show the video. I'm not going to show you that, but this is a wonderful NASA video. Well, wonderful. It's a beautiful video of the progression of this storm moving up the coast and then slamming into New York City and in New Jersey. These are predictions of what was going to happen in New York under the pressure of a major storm, a storm surge. This is the data showing where inundation occurred. You notice this white one here up on this, this is near Sandy Hook, 8.9 feet, 8.9 feet. Here and interestingly, here in the middle of, this is Manhattan here, 7.9, this is Jersey City, 7.9. These are all the data for inundation in this area. This is a map of a projection of which subways, which tunnels and train tracks were going to be most vulnerable, and where the ventilation openings were if there was a storm surge. And all this grayed out area, those are the subways that were knocked out when Sandy came through, right? And that's what it looked like in one of them. This is at Port Jefferson. So we knew at least what was likely. It had been predicted by engineers and scientists, and it happened. So with respect to climate change, as you noticed, I'm not going to give you, this is not going to be a primer on climate change. I'm not going to go through all that again. There's plentiful data and information available on climate change if you want to go into that. But let's just say that we know definitively that the intensity and the frequency of tropical storms is going to increase under the pressure of climate change. I'll just stipulate that, and if you want to talk about that, we can. So Alfred North Whitehead once said, "What is this was actually quoted in Garrett Hardin's classic article, The Tragedy of the Commons. What is tragedy? And Whitehead said, the essence of dramatic tragedy is not unhappiness. It resides in the solemnity of the remorseless working of things. This inevitableness of destiny can only be illustrated in terms of human life by incidents which in fact involve unhappiness. For it is only by them that the futility of escape can be made evident in the drama." So this was Whitehead writing about 1906 or 1910. It should actually, this should say 1948, I'm sorry, not 1848. And it's quoted from Garrett Hardin. So quickly, in the public sphere, who believes that climate change is real? The U.S. National Academies, the U.S. National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, NASA, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the National Institute of Health Science, U.S. Center for Disease Control, U.S. Department of Defense. Please note, the Department of Defense can't afford to listen to the climate change deniers if they're going to make adequate provision for the defense of the country. They have to look at reality. They can't speculate about what might or might not be true, and they believe it is true. Center for Climate Security, this is part of the Department of Defense. Lloyd's of London. This is interesting because several of the big, what are called reinsurers, the ones that back up the insurance industry, are all taking climate change very seriously. Lloyd's of London, Munich reinsurers, the Swiss reinsurers, and here's Standard & Poor's, who recently devalued the United States, if I'm not mistaken. But they're even grudgingly admitting that insurance companies have done pretty well so far in coping with climate change by acknowledging it and making adequate provision for it economically. Harvard University, if Harvard says so, it must be true. Actually, I should mention, I actually looked to see if the University of New Mexico had a strong statement. I didn't find it. Maybe there is one. But Harvard certainly does. This is from the president of Harvard. This was April of this year. And MIT, another one. I did go through some of the other universities, but I'm not going to label all those. So this was an article in the Atlantic talking about this larger problem of future storm surges as a result of Sandy. Mike Bloomberg, mayor of New York, actually as you may remember, took a strong position on climate change in the last election. You can see why. New York is a vulnerable, you can't really, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but if you think about South Florida, the governor of Florida may be denying climate change. But believe me, the people who own real estate in low-lying areas of Florida are taking it very seriously. The communities in Florida are taking it very seriously. Because they're the ones, no matter what the governor has to say about it, they're the ones whose property is going to be at risk. So they're taking it very, very seriously. All right, I am going to play this because this one is very important. We'll just clip ahead here. I hope this will come through adequately. This is a little clip from Climate Reality, which is the organization that Al Gore has helped organize. But I think it's important to have a look at this. And I hope you'll see why in just a minute here, as soon as this cues up. All right, actually, let's...
Smoking contributes substantially
saying cigarette smoking
from certain specific diseases and to the overall death rate.
In January 1964, the Surgeon General published a comprehensive report linking cigarette smoke with cancer and other deadly diseases. Yet it would take decades before the public accepted the true dangers of smoking.
Did you say I'll feel better smoking coat, Moritz?
Yes, you feel better.
How did the tobacco companies manage to lie to the public in the face of all of the scientific evidence? They realized that the science didn't need to be disproven. It was enough to create doubt in the minds of the public to keep them from recognizing the truth.
Tens of thousands of doctors in all branches of medicine in all parts of the country were asked that question. What cigarette do you smoke, doctor? The brand named most was Camel.
The cigarette companies sought to reassure the public that their product wasn't dangerous.
That is wonderful.
Even though it was, and they knew it to be so at the time.
The medical specialist stated that the ears, nose, throat, and etc. adversely affected in the 6 months period by smoking the cigarettes provided.
Where did this fake science come from? The tobacco industry funded private institutes and individuals to create phony science and disseminate it, creating the appearance there was a debate where there was none. Much of this phony science came from this man, Dr. Frederick Seitz, and the institute he co-founded, the Marshall Institute. Their principal strategy was to defend the products by insisting the science was unsettled, and therefore it was premature for the government to act. The Marshall Institute used this same strategy to campaign against the dangers of acid rain, ozone depletion, and DDT.
Used right, it is absolutely harmless to humans and animals.
That's DDT being sprayed on those kids.
In the 1990s, they began a new doubt and denial campaign that would prove more deadly than anything that had come before. This time, Seitz and the Marshall Institute were being funded by the petroleum industry. With funding from oil and gas companies, think tanks and front groups were formed. Their purpose was to raise questions about the reality of climate change and convince politicians and the media that the science was unsettled.
The science is suggesting that maybe all this isn't really happening, or it's not really dangerous, or it's not really man-made.
Holes are being poked in the whole theory of global warming.
Global warming is the biggest delusion of our lifetime. Man doesn't control his climate.
God controls the climate, come on!
Evaluating propaganda isn't that simple. Recognizing the technique is one step. Another step is to know a purpose.
Underlying it all is a simple concept. The public can't understand the complex science of climate change. So convince them that the scientists don't fully comprehend it yet either. And then persuade them that without sound science, it makes no sense to take preventative action.
Please consider yourself to be under oath.
Let me
The tobacco industry.
on the matter of whether or not nicotine is addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive yet.
Carbon dioxide is not a harmful gas.
The more CO2 that's in the atmosphere, the better plants grow.
There is a theological debate that this is a carbon-starved planet.
You believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And that the Earth is actually cooling now. Turns out the planet may be cooling.
The globe hasn't warmed in the last decade.
The science is wrong. The economics is wrong.
None of this snake oil science stuff that is based on this global warming, Gore-Gate stuff.
There are a substantial number of scientists who have manipulated data.
Forget about all that global warming.
I don't believe climate change is real.
Do I believe scientists? No!
I'm confused. How can you know what to believe? So
Truth can only remain hidden for so long. In reality, there is no remaining reasonable doubt about man's influence on climate change. This time, it is not the lives of millions at stake, but billions.
And I do believe that nicotine is not addictive.
All right. I mentioned this afternoon after Daniel's talk. There's a group at Stanford led by a guy named Professor Robert Proctor. There's also a professor down at UC San Diego, Naomi Oreskes, both of whom are involved in what's now called agnotology, which is the study of the deliberate spread of ignorance. And they're really, there's an excellent book by Proctor called Agnotology. You can find it if you're interested. And sorry, we're going to have to skip down here. Okay. This, just if you're curious, is actually, I teach another class on addictions and recovery from addictions where I teach. And this is actually from the Lancet, the British Medical Journal. And it's their depiction of the relative habit-forming properties, the tendency for dependence of these various substances. By the way, this is tobacco up here. The only ones that are higher are heroin and cocaine. All right, so tobacco is way, way up here. And on physical harm, it's not great, but it's certainly a habit-forming substance. And the point, I don't know if you were able to pick it up in that video, but they actually had a memo in which they said doubt is our product. We need to sow enough doubt to allow us to keep doing business. And this is in the face of the fact, as it said at the end of that video, 100 million people died worldwide because of tobacco smoke, almost certainly, because it was a profitable industry. All right. So today, what do we get? This one's only 30 seconds, so I'll play this one too. Hopefully we'll just jump into this. This one is called CO2 is Green. This comes out of Houston or Dallas, I forget which.
Congress is considering a law that would classify carbon dioxide as pollution. This will cost us jobs. There is no scientific evidence that CO2 is a pollutant. In fact, higher CO2 levels than we have today would help the Earth's ecosystems and support more plant and animal life. Please take action. Contact your senator and congressman today and remind them CO2 is not pollution, and more CO2 results in a greener Earth. Go to co2isgreen.com because we all need CO2.
So there you go. That's the oil industry, following directly on that other slide that I showed you. So it's an interesting problem. The two problems that I see with respect to this issue, with respect to public reason and climate change, are one is that there's enormous inertia on the part of the masses of the public. You know, we were talking at lunch about this a little bit. This whole issue with Ebola has gotten people's attention much more acutely than anything that I've seen happen with respect to climate change. You know, there's something about the nature. I personally have argued for years that human health and environmental health are identical, that they're not two different. You can't talk about the environment as if it were somehow separate from health. They're identical, more or less, but significantly. And the Ebola crisis, you know, which is getting people's attention in a way that nothing on the environmental side has done. So there's this massive inertia. I'd be interested to know what you guys think about that in terms of what the sources of that inertia actually are. But the other part is that there is active resistance, and that's what we've just been seeing here. CO2 is green. That whole suite of activities coming out of the Marshall Institute and others, not just the Marshall Institute. By the way, a couple of the guys at Marshall Institute were former directors of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, a former director of the AAAS in the United States. These are very highly placed scientists who have achieved a great deal of power and status in the United States. And yet they're also, as it happens, sort of from the Cold War era, which may be part of that problem, may affect why they're playing that role. So I would say we are in non-ideal conditions. This is from Jonathan Kwong, who's this is writing in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but he's a professor at USC, not too far from where I live. He's basically raising the question of how do we deal with with public reason in situations that are non-ideal. And it's arguable that we might be in that situation. It's very hard, it appears, in Washington, D.C., for even governmental officials, whether they're administrative officials, legislators, or judges, to adopt positions. Probably judges have the easiest time of it to some degree because they have a certain degree of autonomy. This has been part of the environment that we've lived in. Maggie Thatcher also notoriously once said there is no society, which makes it tough to, you know. And I know there was a context, I know the arguments around that. Nevertheless, it's a pretty bald statement. And it's very difficult to look at that statement and say that it doesn't mitigate against public reason, against deliberation, against reasonable comedy, which is respect. By the way, John Rawls talks about civic friendliness. He talks about the duty of civility. These are concepts that it's very hard to apply in Washington, D.C. these days, I would say. In fact, I think when it does happen, it happens behind closed doors because some elements in our culture are so unwilling to allow the possibility that there actually should be cooperation. Okay, so global public reason, that's the next question. If we blow this out to not just a polity, but to global scale, is this even possible to think about? Where multinational corporations and nation states are the primary actors? There was a documentary a few years ago called The Corporation, where they used the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, analyzed the behavior of corporations and asked, is this pathological or not? I mean, their case was that it was. That if they are individuals, then they're pathological individuals. You know, if that legal fiction of the corporation as an individual actually applies. So it's very risky. Yet there are international treaties. The Ozone Treaty is a great example of a treaty that actually has worked. It's achieved the end of the destruction of the ozone using CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. And it appears that the ozone layer is being restored gradually. There are other treaties, the Convention on the Rights of Children, a number of others that are at this website. I'm not going to go there right now. We can later if you want. It's worth asking, why have certain types of treaties been successful in having global effect? You know, that's a very interesting question. And it's worth pondering and worth studying. And so finally, Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, she unfortunately died in June of 2012. I actually was able to meet her once at Indiana University, was at her workshop. She talks about common pool resources, and she's derived a series of principles that she believes are necessary to the operation of a successful CPR, or Common Pool Resource Institution. This comes from her book, Governing the Commons, which is really an excellent book. It's available in digital form. You can get it tonight if you want, if you're in Kindle or some other source like that. So it's a circumscribed notion of what actually works for common pool resources, for commons environments, but the beauty of it is that she's analyzed hundreds and hundreds of cases worldwide, historically and contemporaneously. And so her theories, the reason they gave her the Nobel Prize is because she'd worked on this problem for decades. And in my opinion, you know, that she has if you look at this book, you'll get a chance to see that there are a variety of ways that these principles work. This is one that's most interesting to me. I don't know if you can see this. This is Ventura County, Los Angeles County, San Bernardino County, Riverside, and Orange County. This is where I grew up. I grew up right over these aquifers, and I never knew they were there. These are separate basins, geologically exist in Southern California, and there are separate regimes that govern how the water in these basins, this right here is approximately where the San Gabriel Mountains are that just became a national monument. So these basins are a part of the Los Angeles Basin, but they're actually discrete and separate basins of water. And there are separate regimes governing the appropriation of water in each of these basins. This is approximately where I grew up in this one, which is the San Gabriel, the central San Gabriel, main San Gabriel Basin. She talks about this one up here. This is the Raymond Basin, which is in Pasadena, Altadena. There were over 100 different appropriators contending for use of that water. And they were finally able to negotiate a common agreement with all but one of them. The Michigan-California Water Company didn't want to participate, but 99 others did, and they signed off an agreement that worked out a reasonable way of allocating this resource. This is what we could call a non-trivial problem in California right now. I work in Sonoma part of the time, and about 2 months ago I turned on the taps in the little guest house I stayed in, and there was no water. Well driven, 120 feet down, no water. In the city of Sonoma, in California. I saw a flock of ducks standing on the bottom of a reservoir in Marin County. So these are problems, these are serious issues. And the hope is, the optimistic view of this is that there are solutions that have worked out in the past. But the terms of these solutions, the things that Rawls talks about in terms of deliberative body of public rationality, and that Ostrom talks about in terms of how do we work with common pool resource arrangements successfully. We need to look at these rules, these examples very carefully, challenge them appropriately, as I've tried to do a little bit here, and ask, when we're facing this global crisis of climate change, what are the prospects that we can work out some type of a global solution for this problem? This is Sigmund Freud. He says, the voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing. So maybe there's a little optimism here from Freud. And this is Immanuel Kant again. Dare to know. Have the courage to use your own understanding. And just to close up, this is Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge, which is just across the Nevada border from Death Valley. I work out there quite a lot. This is an amazing story. This place was virtually paved solid. It's the largest oasis in the Mojave Desert. And it was virtually paved solid, or ready to be paved solid, in around 1980. Someone had the insight to create a national wildlife refuge in this area. One of the really interesting features of this area is that it's the home of the Devil's Hole pupfish, little desert fish that lives in this environment. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. By the way, if you ever get the chance to go there, I highly recommend it. It's an amazing site. I could talk about it at length. And this is the that's flowing desert water at this site. Sometimes I just watch this to make myself feel better. That's the wind. Okay. So that's to close on a little bit of a positive note. It is possible for us to redeem, and in fact, a great deal of what we're talking about in the environmental realm now on this planet is really about redemption. It's no longer about, there is no, I hate to say it, but there is no purely pristine area left on this planet. Every dimension of this planet has been impacted by human beings. So what it talked about in Genesis when it said man will have dominion over the earth has happened. Our responsibility now is to say, what will we now do with that dominion? So, okay, that's it. Thank you very much. So am I way over, probably?
Oh, I asked Daniel to make a few comments, and then we can have discussion and questions. Yeah. You can get up if however, yeah.
This is difficult to do off the top, but I'll figure it out. So I guess I'm just going to ask a couple questions.
Sure.
One about the idea of the public. Because so much of your talk was about the possibilities of public reason. And I was curious about the kind of historical context of today and the idea of the public, especially since that idea, that kind of weight of that idea coming from Kant and through thinkers like John Stuart Mill, right, is an idea that's deeply rooted in liberalism and deeply rooted in Enlightenment philosophy and deeply rooted in, emergent industrial economies. In our contemporary environment, and your slide of Reagan and Margaret Thatcher made me think of this most acutely, right? In a world where activating a public seems to require undoing the privatizations that have happened since the 1970s, undoing the privatizations that are described, in economic terms as neoliberalism, right? Privatizations of seeds, privatizations of public resources. Seems as if forming a public requires undoing the privatization of goods that were formerly common and that are no longer. And so I'm curious how, it seems to me that Rawls can't really account for that kind of mechanism, since Rawls is fundamentally not interested in economics. But forming a public today seems to commit you, right, to a certain form of economic agency or economic undoing, right? De-commodifying things that have become commodified. This seems necessary, maybe, to creating a new commons. And so I guess I wonder if you could talk about.
Well, I mean, first of all, to talk about Rawls, I mean, I have tremendous affection for him. I mean, I think his model, he gives one of the clearest and strongest expressions of classical liberalism in this context, in our context, And so, but as I said already, there's a way that his comments sound almost wistful, probably for some of the reasons that you just described. I don't have a complete answer to that question. The deconstruction of a lot of what I've referred to already, many of the things I've talked about, is clearly a task, but how that deconstruction occurs is a problem of public reason, I think. I think it is a problem of trying to do what I've been trying to do today, but multiplied by thousands. You know, we have to look and educate. I mean, sort of underlying all of this to me is public education. You know, I think we were talking at lunch a little bit about my experience in California in the 60s in high school. They required civics. And I had a wonderful civics teacher in high school, Mr. Galanio, who was an Italian guy from New York. And he loved the Constitution, he loved the Bill of Rights, and he taught it very, very seriously. In fact, I was in his class when John Kennedy was killed. As a matter of fact, I remember him crying when that happened too. So I don't think there is an easy answer to the problem. And sadly, I mean, cataclysms can happen, you know, clearly. You know, I mean, the Ebola is a frightening thing, or the idea of a contagion. You know, I have medical friends who are worried about retroviruses and a whole variety of other things, not just viruses that escape from natural reservoirs like Ebola has. Well, like hantavirus, actually, that's one locally here. I remember seeing a presentation here at the University of Mexico a few years ago about people that were studying hantavirus, and they were wearing biohazard suits out in the desert just to collect, you know, yeah, you know, the prairie dogs, yeah. So it's not an easy problem. I don't think there is an easy answer, and I'm suspicious of it, you know, we were talking about Naomi Klein a little bit, who I think is very, very important because of the issues that she's raising, the clarity with which she raises them. But when she talks about the sweeping change, as always, the question is, what's the mechanism of that change? If it's not reasonable, if it can't happen within some sphere, some polity, with some sense of comedy, then how is it going to happen? And I would say, you know, your institute is also supported by peace studies here at you know, I would say that the issue of violent, and coming from someone who was probably more disposed that way when I was in the 60s, that violent change doesn't work. You know? I think if you, well, that's enough to say. That's the best answer I've got for you. Yep. Have any other questions or comments? Things you'd like to talk about? I know it's a lot of material. I realize that. I just did a full download. And I've been thinking about a lot of the elements of this issue for a very long time. So. Yeah, please.
Seems like one of the root problems is population.
That's right.
So what realistic mechanism exists to bring that in?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. You know, I mean, that was the point that Garrett Hardin made most fundamentally in 1968 when he wrote Tragedy of the Commons. He was really using the Thomas Malthus argument that Darwin also used, by the way, about the exponential growth of population. And Hardin says, he uses in the first 5 paragraphs of Tragedy of the Commons, he says repeatedly, there is no technical solution, there is no technical solution. I was laughing with my students because he repeats it 5 or 6 times in the opening of that article, which, by the way, is one of the most highly cited articles in environmental studies in the past 100 years, probably. It's problematic for some other reasons. The answer to your question is I don't know for sure. I think that we have to use education. You know, in coercive, autocratic situations, they've tried to, like in China, they've tried to limit it, and they've also had, for example, the collateral damage of female infanticide, which is not unacceptable, obviously, to my mind, I think to many people's minds. Education has to be, and the dilemma that we face is that population is driven forward exponentially. As you can see, looking at these, just look at the population numbers that I mentioned already. How do we respond urgently enough to take the action? You know, many of the problems that we've looked at, like if you look at the cholera situation, I mean, that was not good. That it took the Germans until 1900 to accept what was proven science in England. The English took a little over about 12 years to really act on it and make changes in sanitation. I mean, that's a latency period of some sort. You know, in Germany, it's an unacceptable latency period. But the problem is that the dilemma we're facing now is become more and more urgent, so that our tolerance for latency is got to be much lower. We may not be able to wait. That's the dilemma we're facing. So whether it's population or any of the other elements of this problem, of which there are several, you know, like carbon CO2 being added to the atmosphere, obviously. The dilemma we face is that we're approaching a crisis point, and how we, a tipping point, and that's what we're all concerned about. I want to be as optimistic as possible, but I would love if somebody had a solution. Somebody could see clearly that we can cut this knot in this way. But in the absence of that, I think we have to move forward. Education has got to be a huge part of it. Informed public discourse, well-informed public discourse, reasonable discussion, encouraging comedy, civic friendship's not a bad idea, It sounds so naive to me right now, but yeah, please.
You're talking about the population. It seems like to me, though, that's kind of a strong man in a sense, because people have to believe their children are going to outlive them, or they won't stop having children. When you have 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 kids, it's in the belief that probably only 1 or 2 are going to.
Safety net, yeah, that's right.
And so when you provide health, and you provide viable incomes, and you provide these things, that the other issues, then
Fair enough, yeah.
The population kind of solves itself. We've seen that in this country in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And in Europe, I would say.
If we believe that the 1 child or 2 children we have will live,
yeah,
then we stop having more.
That's right. That's a fair comment, I think. But again, the question of how soon that can have an effect, have a strong enough effect to have an important consequence.
The sad part about it is the worse it gets, the worse it gets.
Right, exactly.
It's a death rate
That's right.
goes up to have
That's
more
right.
children.
That's right. Yeah. That's a good comment, I think. Yeah. Angus, please.
I'm going back to the pyramid with the wisdom at the top, and that's a point at the top, and suggests that there's going to be someone standing at the top of the pyramid of wisdom, sort of saying, okay, we're all going to do this. What I have in mind is that, sowing doubt, which was the product that permitted that gentleman and his...
The Marshall Institute.
The Marshall Plan, yeah. Permitted the Marshall Plan to work so well. The thing about doubt is that it's an epidemic spread of a disease. It isn't, and it's without leadership. It's a consequence of the mere numerosity. So it's more cloud-like. It doesn't say it's this or it's that. It just says, well, there's this, that, and the other, and a lot of stuff that they mentioned, etc. In other words, there's a difficulty in engaging in action when it's a little bit like asking some part of a cloud to move sideways because I want to fly through. Get out of my way. There's a fundamental problem here, and it sounds rhetorical in a way. Ebola strikes us because it's a one-shot operation when it's presented at first, here in this country, with somebody, a nurse who just came down with it. That's a one person. It's an isolated, rhetorical icon, which is powerful. If you go to West Africa, it's not one person. It's a whole population. And there, it does not have the same grip on the imagination. It's as if there's a whole problem about dealing with the numbers versus action and thinking then, which is taken by small numbers of people, always. Telling the other people, follow me, basically. I hate to say it, but it's a kind of, it's a Führer principle.
What that made me think of in that comment, I don't know if you guys
I'm asking about sort of, this is on my mind a lot.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but there's a professor at Stanford who's done some really very interesting research. What she's done is that she's interviewed schizophrenics in Northern California, in Ghana, and in South India. And she's asked, these are all diagnostically schizophrenics by some standard. There is actually, by the way, a conventional standard for diagnosing schizophrenics. And so she asked them what the voices they heard were saying. And it was very, very interesting. The voices in Ghana that people were hearing were actually, they were construed to be spiritual, like maybe the voice of God or of a spiritual, The voices in South India were family voices very often. That might be a little bit shaming, but nothing like the voices in the United States were violent. encouraging violence and hurting yourself or hurting others. Nobody had ever really thought to do that, to ask schizophrenics, what voices are you hearing in these different cultures? And so the point of that is really to say that in the United States, we have a problem, and so what I immediately thought, Ghana is not that far from where the Ebola stuff is happening right now. There's a different order of problem there in terms of public education and letting people know about public health and communicating public health. But there's also something unbalanced in the United States because of the cultural input, the nurture that we receive here, that schizophrenics here are hearing these horribly violent and destructive voices, and so when you think about doubt, doubt is likely to be much more inflammatory, I think, here in this country, for some reason, for whatever the suite of causes are around that process I just described. I think my thought was that doubt falls into that same category, perhaps. It's something a little bit like the type of voices that a schizophrenic might hear. It is probably, some degree of the response to Ebola is probably pathological. It's not rational, right? Fearful.
I'm just thinking about the numbers, that's all.
Okay.
Just the single.
Well, I wasn't.
The single voices, and then massive voices. And that's fascinating about the voices, of course, because that's really what's at issue with the numbers. On any use and on any arena.
When you were talking about that, the other thought I had is we are talking about a situation where the cloud that we're talking about, this cloud of doubt, has been constructed, has been propagated for mercenary motives quite clearly. Go ahead.
One of the things that's kind of encouraging for me, I guess, is that even at the local level, you have people who are strong climate deniers are being forced to take political action as if they believe in climate change because they're mayors and governors and they've got to deal with being reelected in 4 or 5 years, and somebody comes in and says this drought's going to last at least 10 more years.
Exactly. Well, take the case of Florida, for example, where you've got a climate denier in the governor's office, and you've got people, how many hundreds of billions of dollars of real estate in Florida that are at risk because of sea level rise. There's no doubt about it. You can say whatever you want about climate denial and so forth, et cetera, but the ocean's coming up. They say Mother Nature bats last, right? So the water's coming up, no matter what we say about it. You can be Michelle Bachmann or Sarah Palin or whoever, or Rick Perry. I'm thinking he's in charge of the Ebola crisis or something. I don't know. But you've got people like that. They can say whatever they want. But if you own land in low-lying areas, or if you're in Kiribati in the South Pacific, what are you doing? The water's coming up.
I think I would like to thank you and everyone else, and then invite you to have some cookies and veggies and continue the conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.